Mr. President, anyone watching Congress right now would have little reason to think that an historic election occurred only a few weeks ago. Washington, D.C. sadly continues to remain deaf to the American people. Washington, D.C. continues to refuse to listen to the American people. Even though millions of voters rose up just 1 month ago to protest how President Obama and the Senate Democrats were running Washington, business as usual is continuing inside the marble halls of the United States Congress. What's happening here? Last night, we saw chaos in the U.S. House of Representatives as they were there till late in the night, voting on a bill that the vast majority of the members had never even sat down to read. Yet somehow, at the last minute, just in the nick of time, with an arm twisted here and a nudge there, it passed the House. And now it's here in the United States Senate. Before the Senate today is a $1.1 trillion bill full of Christmas presents for the lobbyists and special interest here in Washington. I know it's Christmas time, Mr. President, but it's not our job to be playing Santa to K Street. This bill is not designed to help working Americans. It is designed to pay off all the promises made to lobbyists who funded campaigns over the past year. It's designed to make sure that a whole lot of folks can fly home, sure that more campaign dollars will be coming in coming weeks. Before the United States Senate is a bill that continues to fund the train wreck that is Obamacare and does nothing to provide relief to the millions of men and women who are hurting, who are suffering, who've lost their jobs, who've lost their health care because of this disaster. And before the United States Senate is a bill that does nothing, absolutely nothing, to stop President Obama's illegal and unconstitutional amnesty. That's why I rise to speak here today. The president's executive amnesty is lawless and unconstitutional. Now, to be clear, the dispute over executive amnesty is not a dispute between President Obama and Republicans in Congress. It is a dispute between President Obama and the American people. In this last election, President Obama said something that was absolutely correct. He said his policies were on the ballot all across this country. The president was right. This election was a referendum on amnesty. Mr. President, I spent roughly 2 months on the road campaigning for Senate candidates all over the country, one after the other, in race after race after race. Front and center was, if you elect Republicans, we will stop President Obama's amnesty. Now, the American people's verdict on that referendum was not ambiguous. Over and over and over again, voters in states across this country decided not to send back the incumbent Democrat, but to elect a new Republican. Mr. President, I'll recall 2 years ago when you and I were freshmen. There were 9 Democratic freshmen that year and just 3 Republicans. Today, there are 12 Republican freshmen, 12 new senators, a quarter of the Republican conference, elected as the result of a referendum on amnesty. The people have spoken loudly. And yet, sadly, President Obama has reacted to the voters in a way that, frankly, is unprecedented in American history. Previous presidents, particularly second-term presidents, have been repudiated by the voters. And there's a way presidents typically respond to that. They react with humility. They react acknowledging the American people, trying to course correct. But sadly, President Obama didn't do that. Instead, he came out angry and defiant. He came out and declared to the American people, it doesn't matter, in his view, what the American people say, and it doesn't matter, in his view, what the Congress elected by the American people says. He is instead going to unilaterally decree illegal amnesty for some 5 million people who are here illegally. We're going to have a vote in time on this omnibus bill. But part of that vote, critical in that vote, should be a vote on President Obama's illegal amnesty. We should consider the constitutionality of his actions. Every senator in this body should be put on record whether he or she believes it is constitutional for a president to disregard, to ignore federal immigration laws and grant blanket amnesty to millions in defiance of both the laws on the books and the voters. You know, this president believes he can unilaterally alter laws he disagrees with. Now, there is a form of government where one man or one woman can make the laws, can change the laws, can enforce the laws. That's called a monarchy. There are countries on earth right now that have monarchies that vest the legislative and executive power in one person. And I would note, as Americans historically, we are not unfamiliar with monarchy. We fought a bloody revolution to free ourselves from a tyrannical monarch. And the Constitution, when our framers drafted it, was designed, as Thomas Jefferson put it, to serve as chains to bind the mischief of government. The danger we are facing here right now is profound insofar as it concerns amnesty, and is even greater as it concerns the checks and balances in our government and the protection of individual liberty. Because a president who can set aside the law, who can pick and choose which law to follow and which law to ignore, is no longer a president. That should concern all 100 senators here. Because you know what? If President Obama can decide, I don't agree with the immigration laws, so I will not enforce them, I'll unilaterally change them, Mr. President, I promise you, there's going to come another president with different policy views, and the next time, it may not be immigration laws that he or she is changing. It may be tax laws or environmental laws or labor laws. Now, I fervently believe we need tax reform and labor reform and environmental reform, but there's a proper way to do it. The proper way to do it is this body debating and making legislative changes to the laws, not one president by diktat setting aside the law. A presidential temper tantrum is not an acceptable means of discourse. You know, one of the characteristics of a monarch is he or she need not compromise. The president has justified this illegal amnesty by saying he told Congress what he wanted and Congress refused to give it to him. Well, Mr. President, the relationship in our constitutional republic between the president and the Congress is not the relationship between a parent and a child. The president does not get to demand of Congress, here is the policy I want, either give me what I want or I will decree it to be so and ignore the law. That is the president's bargaining position. The president wants to reform immigration, and let me be clear. We need common sense immigration reform. I support common sense immigration reform. But the way it works in our constitutional system, if you want to change the laws, you have to work with the other branches, and that means you have to compromise. It means the president doesn't get everything he wants, and this is a president who is barely willing even to talk to Congress, much less to compromise on anything. As Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, A monarch decrees, dictates, and rules through fiat, which is what President Obama is attempting to do right now. And when the president embraces the tactics of a monarch, it becomes incumbent on Congress to wield the constitutional power this body has as the elected people's representatives to stop it. Congress, representing the voice of the people who just spoke resoundingly in an election, should use every constitutional tool available to prevent the president from subverting the rule of law. When the president usurps the legislative powers and defies the limits of his authority, it becomes all the more imperative for Congress to act. And Congress should use those powers given to it by the Constitution to counter a lawless executive branch, or this body will lose its authority. If the president will not respect the people, Congress must. Secondly, let me ask a question. Why are we here today in a lame duck? Why is there a session of Congress the second week of December with so many members voting who the American people just said they no longer want to be represented by? Why are there so many members getting ready to land at cushy law firms and lobby jobs and industry and trade associations? All of our colleagues, a whole bunch of them, we're going to see them again, except they'll have more expensive suits, more finely tailored, and come with an army of lobbyist aides with them. Both the House and the Senate are filled with people who won't be here next year, and that's not an accident. Because these bodies are voting to fund a $1 trillion spending bill, and those members who were defeated or are retiring aren't accountable to anybody. They won't have to answer for this, but it's even worse. I mentioned this omnibus as a payoff to K Street. Well, that's where a lot of these retiring lobbyists, retiring members are going to go. So what a perfect way to start to get your job is to ensure that you come with goodies for the rich and powerful. Look, the American people are disgusted by the way Washington works. Washington, under the Obama administration, takes care of the rich and powerful, those who walk the corridors of power, and ordinary working men and women are left in the dark. People who have been hurt the most under the Obama economy have been the most vulnerable among us. They've been young people, they've been Hispanics, they've been African Americans, they've been single moms. And yet I'm sorry to say in this current Senate there are very, very few advocates for the people who are really hurting. Let me give one example. One of the elements of this bill is the so-called expatriate health insurance plan fixed, that this omnibus exempts from Obamacare. Now, what is this about? Well, American insurance companies that sell insurance policies to expatriates, Americans living abroad, are subject to all of the oppressive mandates of Obamacare. All of the mandated coverage, mandating things like maternity care for women who are no longer in childbearing years, all sorts of mandates that drive up the costs, and they're also subject to the crushing and punitive taxes. So what's happened? The insurance companies have come to Congress and said, hey, it's not fair. It is hurting our business. It's hurting jobs. Obamacare is, and you know what's amazing? You get enough lobbyists together, and suddenly you get bipartisan agreement. This provision had Republicans and Democrats together saying we should carve a special exemption for the big insurance companies. Now, there are a lot of things about this body that they don't teach in civics class. There are a lot of things in this body that would horrify the typical junior high or high school student learning about how government operates. One of them is something called a hotline. An awful lot of legislation gets passed on a hotline. What that is someone introduces legislation, sends around an email, and says, unless you object, this will be treated as automatically passed. All sorts of things get done on the hotline without this body ever debating it, ever considering amendments, ever taking it to the floor. Well, this expatriate insurance amendment was hotlined. Senators, both Democrats and Republicans, wanted to shoot it through in the lame duck in the quiet of night. Now listen, I think there's some good arguments on the merits for this bill. It's not unreasonable, for the expatriate bill, I mean. It's not unreasonable to recognize that Obamacare is costing jobs, it is hurting. But I'll tell you, the way a hotline works is any individual senator can object. So I objected to this. I raised an objection to the hotline, and let me tell you why I did, Mr. President. I said, listen, this may well make sense, but we shouldn't do it with no amendments, no debate in the dark of night. We should do this on the floor of the Senate with a debate and with amendments. And in particular, I want to take the opportunity to ask my friends and colleagues who are Democrats who are supporting this exemption, if you think these provisions of Obamacare are so onerous, are so damaging, are killing so many jobs, why won't you provide an exemption for the people that live in your state? If it's right that these are harmful, why discriminate against the people living in your state? I wanted to take it up on the floor in a context where you could offer amendments to say, listen, it's all fine to take care of the big insurance companies, but how about somebody stand up for single moms? Single moms who are in vast numbers being forced into part-time work, forced to work 28, 29 hours a week because Obamacare, the threshold it kicks in is 30 hours a week. How about somebody stand up for the average working men and women? But I'll tell you what, Mr. President, the single moms, the African-American teenagers, the legal immigrants, they don't have fancy lobbyists. You know, there's no provision in the past several months that I have been more heavily lobbied over than this expatriate bill. I had an insurance company CEO on the phone with me. I had senators on the phone. I had lobbyists on the phone, all saying, look, take care of this provision. And I responded very reasonably. I said, look, we can take it up in just a couple of weeks. In January with the new Congress, we can take this up, we can debate it, we can consider it. But if we're going to be making exemptions for Obamacare, how about we not start with the richest and most powerful corporations? How about instead we start with working men and women? Put working men and women first because they're the ones paying the biggest prices. And yet I'm sorry to tell you, this is a great illustration of how Washington works. When it couldn't get hotlined as its own bill, what happened? It magically appeared on the omnibus. Tacked on in the last minute because they knew that it would just go right through Congress in the dark of night. How profoundly corrupt. Listen, if you're a Fortune 100 company, you should feel thrilled because you can marshal armies of lobbyists to get a special carve-out for you. But if you're a steel worker, out of work, if you're a single mom, if you're an Hispanic teenager trying to get her first job to start climbing the economic ladder and moving towards the American dream, you know what? You don't have a high-paid lobbyist. Unfortunately, this United States Senate is not listening to your concern. We need to change that. We need to change that. You know, another provision of this omnibus is a special carve-out for Blue Cross Blue Shield. Now, Blue Cross Blue Shield is a very fine company. Blue Cross Blue Shield spent more than $15 million on lobbyists this year. Now, it's all fine and dandy that Blue Cross Blue Shield gets a carve-out. What about working men and women? Under the Harry Reid Senate, do you know how many bills we have debated on the floor to provide meaningful relief to the millions of Americans who've lost their jobs, who've lost their health care, who've been forced into part-time work, who face skyrocketing insurance premiums, who've lost their doctors? Zero. Not a single one, because working men and women don't have $15 million to hire fancy lobbyists. And the corrupt culture of Washington listens to the lobbyist and not the people. And let me be very clear on this. This is a bipartisan ailment. Harry Reid and the Democratic Senate has shut this institution down and has ceased working for working Americans. But Republicans share in that sin, share in that embrace of corporate welfare. Enough with the corporate welfare. God bless big companies that provide jobs. We don't need to be providing corporate welfare. How about instead, we have fundamental economic reform that brings back growth, that helps small companies start and grow and create jobs. How about we stop playing favorites and picking winners and losers? And instead, how about Washington listen to the American people? Another provision in this bill, another bit of corporate welfare, is Brand USA, a travel promotion company. That's one of the current majority leader's pet projects because it helps promote casinos in his home state. You know, last I checked, casinos were very profitable endeavors that didn't need the taxpayers helping them out. Didn't need the United States Congress serving your hard-earned dollars and handing it out to promote casinos. Another example is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. It's also reauthorized in this bill. Now, most people haven't heard of it, but let me tell you what it does. Over the past few years, OPEC has approved a $20 million loan to help luxury cars be built in Eastern Europe. Coincidentally, the man who owns the company is a donor to President Obama and Vice President Biden. OPEC has also backed hundreds of millions of dollars for solar farms in South Africa. It's also helped finance the Ritz-Carlton in Istanbul. It's backed $150 million in insurance for Citibank to open branches in Pakistan, Jordan, and Egypt. How is it that one of the largest banks in the world can't get its own insurance? Why should taxpayers take on that risk? They shouldn't. Also spread throughout this bill are all kinds of provisions mandating what kind of vehicles the U.S. government may buy for use. There are limits on how much the car can weigh, rules for how it must be powered, where the corporation is based to be put together. All together work to give U.S. corporations that produce expensive electric cars an advantage. Instead of saving taxpayer monies, this bill is pushing the government to purchase Chevy Volts and Teslas instead of other more affordable cars. Yet another problem in the lame duck was seen in a bill we considered earlier today, the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, the NDAA had a lot of good provisions in it. I serve on the Armed Services Committee. I introduced amendments that were accepted, that were included in the bill, including one that is very near and dear to my heart, a provision that finally allows the 14 innocent souls who were murdered by Nidal Hasan on Fort Hood to be eligible for the Purple Heart. It has been far too long that this administration has declared that terrorist attack to be workplace violence. That was a good provision in the bill. There are other good provisions in that bill. And yet, in the last minute, a giant chunk of legislation got added to the defense authorization that had nothing to do with defense. Instead, it was a giant land grab. And once again, it was bipartisan. It was Democrats and Republicans coming together saying, let's have the federal government seize a bunch of lands. So the Defense Authorization Bill added 250,000 acres of new wilderness designations. The Defense Authorization Bill resulted in 400,000 acres being withdrawn from productive use. It added 3 new wild and scenic river designations, 3 new studies for additional designations. Now, some of these provisions may have been sound on their own, but there's a reason they weren't brought up on their own. There's a reason they weren't debated on the floor of the Senate, because they couldn't withstand the scrutiny. So instead, the way corrupt Washington works, they were stuck onto a defense authorization that was deemed must pass, and suddenly the federal government takes roughly $500 million acres of land out of productive use, out of use by the citizenry. You know, that's disrespectful to the men and women in the military. It's a disservice. We shouldn't be using the defense authorization as a tool for congressional pork. Let me make an additional point about President Obama's amnesty. In all likelihood, in a matter of hours or a matter of days, the Senate is going to pass this massive, pork-filled mess of a bill, trillion-dollar-plus amnesty that is paying off lobbyists throughout this town. And yet, leadership in both bodies, Republican leadership in both the House and Senate, have promised this bill is designed for Congress, in fact, to stand up to President Obama's illegal amnesty. They have said repeatedly that in just a few weeks, help is on the way. In just a few weeks, Republicans will be the majority in this body. In just a few weeks, we will have a new majority leader. The new majority leader, my friend, the senior senator from Kentucky, has said, quote, "If President Obama acts in defiance of the people and imposes his will on the country, Congress will act. We're considering a variety of options, but make no mistake, when the newly elected representatives of the people take their seats, they will act." Madam President, I take the soon-to-be majority leader at his word. Speaker of the House has likewise said, quote, "Come January, we will have a Republican House and Republican Senate and will be in a stronger position to take actions," he said. The Speaker went on to say the current plan is the most practical way to fight the President's actions. Again, I take him at his word. When the Republican leaders promise this bill is all designed so come January and February, just a few weeks from now, we will see both houses stand together and make clear that when the continuing resolution expires for the Department of Homeland Security, this body will not appropriate money to DHS to carry out President Obama's illegal and unconstitutional executive amnesty. I take them at their word, because the alternative would be that elected leaders were saying something to the American people they don't believe and they don't intend to follow through on. And I very much hope that is not the case. Indeed, I'm reminded of Reagan's famous admonition, trust but verify. So I take them at their word, but I would note that a whole lot of citizens across this country feel a little bit like Charlie Brown with Lucy and the football, where in fight after fight, leadership in Congress says, we'll fight next time. Not this time. No. The wise thing to do is fight in a month, fight in 2 months, fight in 3 months, not now. And it always seems to be that when that month or 2 months or 3 months happened, the same statement is made. You know what? No. Not January, February, really March. No, not that. How about June? No, not that. How about September? And there comes a point where Charlie Brown has kicked the football and fallen on his rear end one too many times. So when our leaders in both chambers say, as a commitment, we will fight and we will stop President Obama's illegal amnesty, I take them at their word, but I am confident the American people will hold them to their word. The American people may not be quite so trusting as am I, because they've seen far too many members of Congress say one thing and do another. And we will learn soon enough if those statements are genuine and sincere. We will learn in just a few weeks if leadership intends to follow through on the promises they have made over and over again. And I would note, the course of this election Republicans, members of the House, Republican members of the Senate, campaigned all over this country, and they said two things repeatedly. They said, number one, if you elect us, we're going to do everything humanly possible to stop the train wreck, the disaster that is Obamacare. And they said, number two, if you elect us, if you give us a Republican majority in the Senate, we will stop President Obama's illegal amnesty. All over the country. That's what Republican candidates said, and it's the reason they told the American people to elect a Republican majority. My simple admonition to my friends, especially to the newly elected Republicans, is very, very simple. Do what you said. Simply do what you said. Virtually every Republican on this side of the chamber told the men and women in his or her state, if you elect us, we will stop President Obama's amnesty. We must do what we said because it is profoundly unfair. This amnesty is unfair to millions of legal immigrants who followed the rules, who waited years in line, and yet see those who came illegally being rewarded nonetheless by the Obama administration. This executive amnesty is profoundly unfair to the 92 million Americans who are not working right now. To all the working men and women who are struggling to just put food on the table to feed their kids. This executive amnesty is profoundly unfair, especially to the African American community, which is facing historic unemployment. And if Congress acquiesces, if Congress does not stand up and assert the prerogative of this institution to legislate, to pass laws, if Congress does not prevent the president from ignoring the laws on the books, then we will have ceded our authority, not just in immigration, but across the field. It is incumbent on all of us to defend the Constitution. And it is my hope that the senators who take an oath to uphold the Constitution will honor that oath more than party allegiances. I would note in recent weeks, no fewer than a dozen Democratic senators have publicly criticized President Obama's illegal executive amnesty. I welcome that criticism. It is nice to see that sort of candor coming from Democratic senators. But, you know, as my wife is fond of telling me, talk is cheap. If those dozen Democratic senators that have criticized President Obama's executive amnesty as illegal and unconstitutional mean what they say, then the only responsible action is to use our legislative authority to stop it. I would hope that my Democratic colleagues would put partisan politics aside. Even some who may agree with President Obama's amnesty would say the way to change the immigration laws is to work with Congress to compromise. You may not get everything you want, but we have a system of checks and balances. You know, Madam President, it's striking. In many ways, the simplest and best explanation of what the president has done came from Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live, the week after the president's illegal amnesty, reprised the classic Schoolhouse Rock, How a Bill Becomes a Law. And they had a giant dancing, singing bill coming out saying, first I go to the House, then I go to the Senate. If I'm lucky, the president will sign me and I become a law. And then on Saturday Night Live, President Obama walked out onto the steps of the Capitol and pushed the bill down the steps of the Capitol. 4 separate times he pushed the bill down the steps of the Capitol. And instead out walked an executive order, smoking a cigarette as it so happens. Simply said, I'm an executive order. That pretty much just happened. You know what? Saturday Night Live is exactly right. The president is ignoring the basic checks and balances of our Constitution and trying instead to decree the law. That is unconstitutional.